Now, one reason why the Arabs found it so easy to dominate the Mediterranean was their superior knowledge of shipbuilding techniques. It's an interesting fact that not only did the early Muslims suddenly acquire the military prowess that enabled them to conquer the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire of Persia simultaneously, which you would think was some kind of military madness, the equivalent, say, of Upper Volta today simultaneously declaring war on the United States and Russia. In those terms, it was quite comparable. But they did that and they succeeded. They divided their forces, defeated both of these great empires. But something we less frequently recall is the fact that very rapidly the early Arab Muslims became a great maritime nation. In the time of the fifth Caliph Muawiyah, the first significant fleet was constructed by the Arabs in Alexandria, and they showed themselves such good sailors that they promptly thrashed the Byzantine navy and established unchallenged Muslim naval superiority throughout the Mediterranean, with the exception only of the Aegean and parts of the Tyrrhenian Sea, which were still regarded as being within the Byzantine sphere of influence. So they had this extraordinary ability to adapt. But in the longer term, what proved no less influential was their knowledge, as I've said, of shipbuilding techniques. And this again was made possible by the fact that the Muslim empire straddled both halves of the formerly divided world. What the Muslims did was to import into the Mediterranean shipbuilding techniques that had long been known amongst the navigators in the far more difficult and treacherous waters of the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, the distances were much more considerable. Sometimes ships would go as far as China. And the ships were a lot larger and they were a lot sturdier. So we find these ships immediately being introduced into the Mediterranean with the Muslim port cities of Syria and Egypt particularly. The galley, which had formerly been the main method of long-range seafaring in the Mediterranean, was not completely displaced, but by and large the Muslims didn't use galleys very much, largely because they had something called the lateen sail. I'm afraid I can't tell you whether this is actually a word of Oriental origin. It might be. But it was much more effective and efficient than the former rather simple square sails, single-masted square-sailed vessels which had been used in the Mediterranean hitherto, the so-called carrack. Now, European shipbuilders in due season started to pick up on these Arab techniques, and they started to improve on them. And in fact, it is accepted that the great journeys of discovery undertaken by the Europeans in the 15th century, whether around the Cape or across to the Americas, were based in large measure on this Indian Ocean technology that had been brought to the Mediterranean by the Arabs. The use of multi-masted vessels, for instance, hitherto unknown, the use of this lateen sail, and certain technical improvements on how you actually bolt together and caulk a seafaring vessel. So because of this capacity of the Europeans to emulate these innovations, European navigators started to rejoin the world of trade. So Amalfi becomes a Christian city once more. And if you ever visit Italy, south of Naples, Amalfi is certainly one of the most splendid places to visit. It has a wonderful 11th century cathedral, one of whose most interesting features is its, I think, quite happy combination of Moorish and Christian Gothic idioms. The cloisters there in particular are almost completely Moorish in inspiration, with characteristically Sicilian Arab forms of decoration. But it becomes a Christian city again and continues in its former role as a great maritime city. And its example is followed in the 2 centuries that followed by places like Pisa, Genoa, and of course Venice, all beginning their own illustrious maritime histories in this period. Now, these Europeans had trading partners in North Africa, and by this time many of the leading mercantile families in North Africa were not Muslims, but were actually North African Jews. And the reason why North African Jewry flourished in this period, at least commercially, was that it was easier for Jewish merchants to visit Europe and trade than it was for Muslims, because there was some kind of tradition of tolerating a Jewish presence in most European cities. There were ghettos where they could live and so forth. People had experience of them, whereas it was much more difficult in practice for a Muslim merchant to visit Europe. So we have at this point the emergence of very important Jewish contributions to Mediterranean trade. Now the pattern so far established starts to be fractured when a dynasty known as the Fatimids, who are a Shia dynasty of Ismaili proclivities, seize control first in Tunisia and then 20 years later in Egypt. Now, one of the things Fatimids want to do is to challenge the Abbasid Caliphate and to flex their muscles in the Mediterranean. And immediately they start to build the largest fleets that the Muslim world has ever seen. And they start to import a lot of wood and iron from Europe. And this is one of the things that promoted the growth of trans-Mediterranean trade at that time. Another thing that made the Fatimids particularly important in Islamic trade was the fact that the Persian Gulf was at that time obstructed by a bunch of extremists, really, called the usual English version of this is the Karmatians, who were an even more extreme group of Shia who held that Ali was actually an incarnation of the divine. And they wouldn't let anybody go through the Gulf. So these cities of Ubulla and Basra immediately fell into more or less complete redundancy. And Egypt becomes much more important. And from this time, Egypt, really until the 17th and 18th century, remains the great Muslim center for international trade. Another boost to world trade that was at least mediated by Muslim civilization to Europe was the invention sometime in the 12th century of the compass. Obviously of huge importance if you were actually going to be courageous enough to travel across the open sea rather than hugging the coast as most people previously had done. And we don't actually know who invented the compass. Some say the Chinese, who passed it to the Arabs. Some say the Arabs invented it. Some say the Persians. There are even theories to suggest that it was the Italians. But in any case, the most advanced early compasses came from the Islamic world. Another development, almost certainly of Islamic origin, was something called the portolan. Portolan is a kind of map or a chart. Obviously, map making is one of the most mathematically complicated of activities, and the Romans and the early medievals hadn't done it at all well. But with the use of the portolan, whose technical aspects I don't think I'll attempt to outline here, exact navigation with the help, of course, of the compass and other Arab innovations such as the azimuthal quadrant and the astrolabe became something of an exact science. Now, this great domination of the seas by the Islamic world has left permanent memories even in the English language. I've just dished out a list of Arabic words that are of Islamic and of English words that are of Islamic origin. For instance, the most obvious of these is the word admiral. Admiral actually comes from the Arabic Amir al-Bahr, prince or commander of the sea. Sometimes it's thought to be a corruption of Amir al-Rahl. Rahl was a word that was used sometimes for a fleet. Other words such as monsoon or sloop or bark or even cable are also of Eastern origin. And this is a reminder, even in our language today, of this erstwhile domination of the seas by the Muslim world. Now, newly conscious of themselves, as Pirenne indicated, and effectively surrounded by Muslims on all sides, the non-Europeans until this time did have a tendency to think of every other part of the world as inhabited exclusively by Muslims. They had vague ideas, which even they sensed to be legendary, of an Eastern king called Prester John, perhaps in Ethiopia, who one day, if only he could be contacted, could attack the Muslims from behind and Islam would be definitively defeated. But generally we find, for instance, in the 12th century writer, William of Malmesbury in England, an absolute assumption that outside Europe everybody is a Muslim. However, partly because of these improved techniques of navigation, this started to change, and with it came a major transformation in Europe's view of the world. When the Christians reconquered Sicily in the 11th century, the Norman king of Sicily, Roger II, died in 1154, was curious to know more about the outside world, and he commissioned a Muslim scholar of Cordoba called Al-Idrisi, yet another product of the brilliant college that was the great mosque in Cordoba. And he asked Idrisi to draw a map of the whole world. Idrisi, by the way, died in 1166. And Idrisi duly produced not just one, but a series of 70 maps. 70 detailed maps, and many of these have survived, and they are the world's oldest, very detailed maps that attempt to be comprehensive. And these revealed the very, very detailed extent of Muslim knowledge, not just of the Muslim world, but of elsewhere. For instance, there's a map of England. Idrisi himself had travelled in England, and he mentions even small northern towns like Yarmouth and Grimsby, and places that probably most Sicilians wouldn't have heard of. And he places them quite accurately on his map. So these 70 maps, together with an accompanying manual that Idrisi also wrote, became known as the Book of Roger. And this book, or summaries thereof, become the chief source of European Christian knowledge of the wider world.